Apologies to all of you for the delays, IT delays creating some difficulty and forcing us to move rooms. We are 7 or 8 minutes behind schedule, so we're going to go fast into the session. My name is Pierre Sauvé. I am from the World Bank office here in Geneva. The World Bank Group is a very proud member of the WTO Gender Research Hub, a founding member. And we very much look forward to collaborating and contributing to the Hub's work. The purpose of today's session is really to sort of introduce the Hub to the community of people concerned with issues of trade and gender, to socialize its aims, and to give a sense of the kind of work that we hope to promote through collaboration between the various stakeholders in international organizations, both multilateral and regional, from academia, from civil society, and so on. So we're very much looking forward to today's discussion, which is in a way the launch globally of the Research Hub. We have structured our discussion today around 4 themes: the impact of gender gaps or research on gender gaps in employment, on female entrepreneurship, the impact of trade agreements on gender, and the impact that COVID has exerted on gendered outcomes in trade. And so without further ado, let me start this conversation by asking Anush, my colleague from the WTO, to say a bit more about the Hub, its aims, its organization, and then we'll open the floor to a discussion of the 4 themes I just described. Thank you so much. Anush.
Thank you, Pierre. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I just wanted to give some perspective on what the Hub is doing and its purpose. So the Hub, actually the WTO Gender Research Hub was created on the 31st of May at the initiative of the WTO, with the objective of fostering research and collaborations between trade and gender experts from international organizations and from the academic world. So the participants of the Hub include the WTO, of course, the World Bank, as Pierre said, as a founding member, the OECD, UNCTAD, the IMF, and ITC. We also have 2 regional organizations, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. We also have representatives from academia, from the Graduate Institute, University of Western Ontario, the University of Chile, the Wageningen University. I had rehearsed that word, but sorry. The American University, the University of Ottawa, the University of Manchester, and the University of Sussex. With us, we also have 4 WTO chairs from Mexico, Chile, Barbados, and South Africa. So all these experts create this network of experts that will move forward the trade and gender research. This is the first public event of the Hub, actually, but we'll have many others. We're planning a series of workshops throughout 2022, and the first international conference on trade and gender research in December 2022. So everything will be soon communicated via the WTO website, so I invite you to stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Anush. We, the World Bank with the WTO last year produced a major study on women in trade, in many respects, the first comprehensive attempt to make sense of the gendered impacts that trade exerts on women. And I guess one of the main findings of this work was the paucity of data. And I think one of the main aims of the Research Hub will be to produce evidence in support of more informed policies towards gender equality and the empowerment of women, including in trade. And so today we are going to begin this journey of trying to adduce some evidence in support of the impact that trade exerts on gendered outcomes And I said earlier, we're going to do that by looking at 4 specific areas. And we start first with the issue of gendered gaps in employment. And the first speaker will be my good friend and former colleague at the OECD, Jane Koronek. And Jane, the question that we will address in this first session is a pretty straightforward one. How can trade liberalization support female labor force participation? And what policies are required to ensure that female workers benefit from the new opportunities that may flow from participation in cross-border exchange? Jane, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Pierre, and good morning, everyone. We know that trade impacts women and men differently, in part because they work in different sectors. Women work more in services sectors, they work in textiles and clothing, and in some developing countries in agriculture. So the market access that is provided by trade agreements and trade policies will impact men and women differently. If a trade agreement provides export opportunities in sectors where women work, demand for those jobs will increase and women will benefit. If trade opportunities are opened in a sector which is predominantly where men predominantly work, then they will benefit more. So it is important to measure the impacts of trade on women and on men. Some countries are already doing this. Canada undertakes ex-ante impact analysis of its trade agreements. UNCTAD has done this type of analysis as well, looking at the EPA between the European Union and East Africa and how that affects Kenyan women. And at the OECD, we have developed a comprehensive framework of analysis to examine the impact of trade on women, workers, entrepreneurs, and consumers. And we're applying that framework to the first trade and gender review in New Zealand. Not only does trade impact employment, but it also impacts workers' wages. We know that jobs in firms that are engaged in trade are better paid than similar jobs in firms that do not trade. And workers in firms that are engaged in global value chains are much more likely to be employed in the formal sector. So preparing women for work in jobs that are integrated in global value chains can have a positive effect on their income. Some trade agreements already include provisions to promote gender equality. For example, bilateral trade agreements between EU and Montenegro or EU and Algeria include provisions for cooperation to ensure access at all levels of education and without discrimination based on gender. And the more recent US-Mexico-Canada agreement includes provisions to protect women against employment and wage discrimination, in particular on the basis of gender. So ensuring that women can work, that they're paid equally, and that they can attain leadership roles as their male counterparts do, can create a positive spiral, because the research that the hub has brought together from Finland to Uganda, from Georgia to the European Union, shows that women in leadership positions tend to hire more women. Again, a positive spiral to support women and reduce inequalities.
Thank you very much, Jane. Now I'm going to turn to my colleague Amelia Santos Paulino from UNCTAD for a short additional comment on this topic.
Many thanks, Pierre and Jane. And given the short time, I will focus on the key findings of a report that we published recently on multinational enterprises and international transmission of gender policies and practices. So what we looked was at how this mechanism operate in local labor markets in developing countries and what are the relevant gender gaps in employment. So first, we show that MNEs, multinationals, affect gender equality in host countries directly through the employment practices in foreign affiliates and indirectly through spillovers in local labor markets. A key issue related to the gap is that the direct effect is especially pronounced. It impacts more female opportunities for high skilled women. So the female gap here is highly pronounced between skilled and non-skilled workers. Then the other issue that we look at is the adoption by MNEs of explicit non-discrimination policies, ensuring equality in hiring practices. That includes pay and promotion opportunities across their network of affiliates, as well as other labor policies directed towards gender equality. And these are key issues for a positive impact. Then we look at the transmission mechanism in different countries like Bangladesh, Costa Rica, Vietnam, and South Africa. And we show that there are supply chain linkages with local firms. And there are also competition and demonstration effects in countries like Costa Rica. And there are also technology effects that basically we show that the local adoption of technologies that favor female participation in the workforce are very important. So here we have three different mechanisms that have not been explored exhaustively. And these mechanisms are interdependent, and this is very important to keep in mind, and the relative importance depends on country and industry-specific circumstances, so we cannot look at the macro level. So the outcomes in developing countries via the different transmission mechanisms can be positive, although it's not automatic. We show in general that MNEs affect gender equality in the workplace of the host country foreign affiliates, but depending on an MNE home country's norms and values and those of its customers, stakeholders basis, the impact will be positive or not. So I'm happy to come back because I know that time is limited, but basically just to wrap up, we look at competition, technology, and labor mobility effects, and they are very important to explain these gender gaps in employment. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Amelia. A very rich research agenda on the FDI side, which I think is extremely important in a world of GBCs. The relationship between trade and investment critical. So we need to look at both the trade and investment sides of the equation. And of course, as you just said, also the competition and technology aspects. Let me move on to our second theme. We're really rushing. We need more of these meetings to go into greater depth. The second session, the second research question we'd like to discuss briefly is the issue of female entrepreneurship. And the question I will direct to Amrita Bari, who is a member of the WTO Academic Chairs Program at ITAM in Mexico, one of the most dynamic chairs, I'm glad to say, as a member of the Academic Chairs Advisory Board. Amrita, how can women entrepreneurs respond to global trade competition, and how are these issues being addressed by members at both the national and regional levels? Amrita, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the question. Allow me to answer this question by presenting three different findings.
You seem muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So allow me to answer this question, Pierre, by presenting three different findings from our research hub paper in this respect. The first finding relates to public procurement. We found that public procurement accounts for around 1/5 of global GDP, but to date, women businesses supply to only 1% of this market. The barriers that could be blamed for this include lack of information on bidding opportunities, inability to meet the bidding requirements due to lack of time, expensive standards, and certification requirements, large and capital-intensive nature of contracts, trade financing problems, and others. Can existing trade policies help? Yes, they can. Well, some countries have addressed these issues in their FTAs. For example, we find that in the EU, Canada, and in the US, Dominican Republic, Central America trade agreements, parties reserve a right to offer favorable government procurement programs for the provision of social services or grants, such as for childcare. Then other countries have addressed this issue in their domestic public procurement laws. For instance, there are countries that have created preference schemes for women-owned businesses through a quota allocation. And then there are other countries that have provided in their procurement laws a clause that generally prohibits discrimination on the allocation of contracts. Finding number 2. The onset of this pandemic has made it clear that digital access is no longer a luxury. It is an absolute necessity. Yet, more men than women continue to have access to internet in pretty much all the regions of the world, particularly in LDCs where internet gender gap stands at 31%. So digital inclusion of women remains a challenge, and it impedes their access to opportunities offered by e-commerce. Once again, trade policies can help address this challenge as well. Countries in their trade agreements, if you look at CPTPP or Peru-Australia agreement, have promised to act upon enhancing women's access to technology and internet. And it is interesting to see that these same countries have designed capacity building programs for women entrepreneurs. For example, Australia has developed an online training course with modules on export readiness, legal requirements, export opportunities, and e-commerce for women businesses in the APEC region. My finding number 3, this is the final finding that I'll present, is about the size and the scale of women businesses. About 42% of women-led companies are micro, as compared to 22% of men-led companies. And only about 19% of trading companies are women-led. And this can be blamed, of course, on various challenges, including lack of access to finance, information, business skills. Pretty much women businesses are often caught in this never-ending negative loop. Their small size prevents them from accessing finance and trade, which then prevents them from diversifying and growing, and hence they remain small. And I need to quote Anush for this negative loop equation because I learned it from one of her works. Can policies help in this respect, in the respect of this challenge? Yes. Countries and their national laws have adopted measures to increase women's access to finance. For example, one country has adopted programs to help local women-owned firms without collaterals or without credit history to secure loans from microfinancing institutions. And then we have some other members who have support programs for MSMEs, where they reserve quotas for women MSMEs to receive funding for their companies. These concerns are also acknowledged in several FTAs, where countries have taken commitments on promoting financial inclusion, not only for women, but also for MSMEs. So of course, there are challenges, but there are solutions too. And the good news is that we can find these solutions in the existing policies, but then we need to make them work and put these policies into action, and most importantly, keep these discussions going.
Thank you very much, Amrita, for that very interesting observation. I think on your first point on procurement, trade policy has traditionally found ways of addressing discrimination against minorities, for example. I have been party to a number of negotiations in which there are very active set-aside programs for distinct groups. So I think there are some ready-made solutions that could be found that would favorably discriminate towards women to increase their participation. The numbers you cite are really shocking on the procurement front. And your point on access to internet, we're living right now because 2 of our would-be speakers are having difficulty connecting. So we are just confirming what you just said, both Nadia and Judith. So in light of this internet connectivity issue, I'd like to just pass the floor very briefly to Anush, who can complement, Amrita, what you said by just focusing on the role of aid for trade in addressing some of these gaps that you identified. Anush?
Thank you, Pierre. Yes, so in fact, the issue of gender and women's economic empowerment was included in the Aid for Trade initiative since its creation. And it has been looked at as a cross-cutting issue throughout the initiative since then. We can see now until until today that both donors of Aid for Trade and recipients of Aid for Trade has integrated gender issues in their Aid for Trade strategies or even development aid. We have seen that, and today they are really equally integrating this issue in their strategies. Now, does it sprinkle down to the ground, to the projects? Well, that's the issue. Actually, it doesn't do that much. But in any case, we can see that, for example, we have some countries that specifically allocate a certain percentage of their development aid to Aid for Trade targeting women. Some of these aim to improve income generation opportunities for women-owned businesses and workers, or to strengthen the gender dimension of public policy. And of course, some of these allocations can go up to 20%. Some countries are also monitoring and evaluating each of their Aid for Trade programs by using gender equality and inclusion indicators to assess whether gender issues are effectively integrated. Looking at broader terms into trade in terms of trade policy, we have also this issue integrated in many different RTAs and FTAs, and Aid for Trade is a supporter of all these different policies that are being set up by governments. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anoush. What I find interesting, Amrita, in your presentation is that it shows also that the response to these challenges do not necessarily always relate to the domain of trade policy. Trade policy cannot address all of those challenges. And so we need, in pursuing policies of gender empowerment and gender equality, to really have a sort of multi-layered governance approach. Access to the internet is not something that trade policy can easily fix. Access to finance, which is endemic in SMEs and even more so in female-led SMEs, once again, trade policy can nudge. Aid for Trade can help in sensitizing these issues, but I think the answers need to be found complementary in a complementary manner to trade policy. But it's a perfect segue to our third theme, because with Renata Amaral, who is from the American University Washington College of Law, we're going to look at research that focuses on the impact that trade negotiations exert on women empowerment. So Renata, the question I have for you is, how do trade and investment agreements benefit women? What evidence do we have of these benefits, of these impacts, and what trade policies may be needed to ensure that women are not left behind in the trade liberalization process? On to you, Renata.
Thank you very much for the question, Pierre. I'm very glad to be here with you all today. I would like to be there in Geneva. Allow me to divide my remarks into three subtopics that address the work and findings of the experts of the hub so far. So I'm going to divide in tariffs on goods, tariffs on services, and trade and investment agreement negotiations. The findings on tariffs on goods, the first subgroup, shows that data across 40 countries shows that the sector with the highest female employment share, for example, food and beverages, faces average import tariffs on imports more than twice as high as the sector with the lowest share, for example, mining. The policy implication of this needs to be a re-evaluation of tariff rates and an ex-ante gender-based analysis regarding the impact of future trade cost changes stemming from multilateral agreements, regional trade agreements, or unilateral actions. For example, the EU has conducted a gender impact analysis prior to conclude the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement. The assessment considered the potential impacts of the FTA on women as wage workers, entrepreneurs, and consumers in three main economic sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. On subgroup number 2, tariffs on services, the findings were the following so far. The growth of services employment caused by service liberalization can contribute to gender equality in the area of education. An analysis of the Indian services liberalization reforms in the 90s shows that the growth of services employment can account for almost 10% of the subsequent decline in the gender education gap in the country. While the study shows a positive impact on education outcomes, services growth is likely to benefit gender equality in many other aspects as well. Some countries have undertaken initiatives to promote women in the services, such as the tourism sector, for example. And I'll give you two examples on that. The German Agency for International Cooperation supports a women's cooperative involved in the promotion of argan oil in Morocco. The cooperative organizes tours of its facilities, and visitors can see the production process of different items. The agency provided technical assistance and entrepreneurial training, as well as modern equipment, as part of the agency's initiative to support sustainable tourism in rural areas. As a result, the cooperative's sales have increased by 50%. Another example, Cabo Verde, in collaboration with UN Women, has developed the Action Plan for Gender Mainstreaming in Tourism, aimed at addressing the challenges faced by women involved in the tourism sector. Similarly, Mexico has created a gender unit within the Tourism Secretariat to advocate for women entrepreneurs in the tourism sector. In addition, the gender unit has developed capacity building programs and awareness training on sexual harassment and gender equality. The third subgroup and final one that I will address are the findings in the trade and investment agreement negotiations. Public and private trade and investment policies and regulations are of fundamental importance to further women's economic empowerment, creating opportunities for employment, entrepreneurship, and inclusive growth. To balance the effects of improving international investment flows and economic liberalization, governments and private stakeholders, multinationals for example, should include a gender perspective in their trade and investment policies in the domestic and in the international levels. To finalize this round, I have some examples of gender-related provisions in bilateral investment agreements, BITs, that are worth mentioning just to finalize. Several recent BITs include a wide range of obligations for the investors to comply with sustainable development objectives, which could include the adoption of a gender equality policy. In addition, some chapter on investment in RTAs, for example, includes references to gender equality in the provision of on corporate social responsibility. The USMCA is an example. The BITs between Rwanda and the United Arab Emirates or Hungary and Cabo Verde protect investors against gender-based discrimination of the host states' actions. And finally, among the few examples of countries that have submitted model BITs containing gender provisions is the Netherlands, with the most recent version of the government's model BIT from 2019. Amid the changes introduced by this model, it includes a commitment to promote equal opportunities and participation for women and men in the economy. The Dutch model BIT is relevant because it sets the scene for the new generation of international investment agreements, and it highlights the importance of incorporating gender perspective in the promotion of inclusive growth and equal opportunities between men and women. Thank you very much, Pierre.
Thank you, Renata. I think what I really like from your presentation is the fact that it reminds us of the need to be much more granular in distinguishing how women are affected by trade, whether they are workers or consumers, how it affects household income. Very often women lead households, and therefore the basket of goods that they consume will be affected by trade. How it affects female entrepreneurs, as Amrita just showed. So this distinction really calls for much more detailed evidence-based research, which I hope the hub participants will be able to investigate, including also, as you just mentioned, on the investment side. Just an announcement, because both Judith and Nadia are unable to be connected to our session, and we very much regret that. We are going to post in the chat box the texts of the interventions they wanted to make. So please, you may find those interventions in the chat box. I'm going to give the floor to Jane Korinek from the OECD once more, who has a few more thoughts to share with us briefly on this impact of trade negotiations on women. Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. Just a few words to complement what Renata has already said that kind of covered a lot of ground already. I wanted to suggest that we could also look at this question from the point of view of consumers, a kind of point of view that people generally look at a little bit less often. To complement what Renata has already talked about in terms of sectors where women work, for example, where, as she said, tariffs are often higher, particularly sectors where women work in developing countries. So if we look from the consumer side, we know, and a wide body of research indicates that one of the main gains from trade is to lower prices for consumers and increase the variety of goods that are available to them. And lower prices particularly benefit lower income households, because lower income households spend a greater share of their income. So lower prices through trade mean that purchasing power of the lower income households rises. And women are disproportionately found in lower income households due to gender wage gaps, due to the fact that they are more often single parents, and because they sometimes interrupt their careers to have and raise children or to care for elderly family members, which also means that they have lower pensions. So trade agreements and trade policies that lower tariffs and lower non-tariff measures can benefit, in fact, even more women and other vulnerable consumer groups. So, the policy implication is clearly pro-trade, but it also indicates, and to kind of complement what Renata said again, that the impacts of trade on these consumer groups should be measured in ex ante impact analyses.
Thank you very much, Jane. We move on to the fourth and last leg of our session by focusing on something that is very close and still very palpable, and that is the impact that the COVID crisis has and continues to exert on women in the multiplicity of ways in which they engage in trade. And for this session, I'm going to ask Anoush Del-Bogossian from the WTO to perhaps say a few words and explain what the WTO is doing in this space in terms of monitoring work, and perhaps also say a few words about some joint work that is being done with Amrita, notably, in this space. Anoush, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre. So as you said, the COVID-19 crisis has really exacerbated already existing gender inequalities and has increased the disadvantages women face economically, socially, financially. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has, I think, set women backwards economically and socially. If you look at employment, women have been hit harder than men by job losses. The economic crisis destroyed 4% of women's employment worldwide, which is a drop of 54 million jobs compared to 3% for men. So that's in 2020. In terms of income, it means that globally women have lost $800 billion in income in 2020. So women have lost their jobs because they work in sectors that were hit the most by the crisis. they are really concentrated in sectors such as tourism and hospitality, agriculture and food production, retail, garment and textile, domestic services, just to name a few. So these sectors actually require face-to-face interactions that were made impossible by COVID-19 bans and confinement measures. So if just giving an example of one sector, looking at tourism, for example, that employs 54% of women globally. Overall and worldwide, the sector lost about 62 million jobs, most of them held by women. If we look at regions, for example, in the US, women, the tourism job losses in the US were 50%, 53% for women, and 45% in Latin America, for example. And in fact, the reason is also, because women are less resilient to economic crisis, as they tend to be mostly employed in low-skilled, low-paid, part-time and informal jobs. Women entrepreneurs are also disadvantaged because they are very small and they have difficulties in accessing finance, which is a key issue here in the COVID-19 crisis, because actually women entrepreneurs have been de facto excluded from government schemes, putting them in dire financial situations. Just to give you a few examples, some of these schemes requirements allow to have access to financial support only if you have a certain number of employees, for example. But we know that women entrepreneurs mostly are not, are very micro level, and sometimes they're just self-employed. Most of them are self-employed, so working from home, so also working from informally. So they could not have access to these sort of schemes. Some schemes also are just a simple continuation of the existing loans that these businesses have. And we know also that women entrepreneurs don't have access to traditional financial institutions or financial loans. So they often go as well informally for this, for financing their businesses. So these schemes really don't apply to their situations or their specific needs. So in fact, we've seen that today there's many different existing policies and provisions in trade agreements that can support women, as described by panelists today. And some of them can also support women in the COVID-19 crisis. We can see provisions favoring women, such as reservations of women-owned businesses in government procurement, women's access to education, skill development, digital learning, and entrepreneurial capacity, the protection of women against violence, conflict, and discrimination, access to information, finance, and other productive resources, protection of small businesses, and expansion of market access. So these are provisions that are extremely crucial to support women in this crisis. These findings are also found in a paper that Amrita and I have written and is about to be published, I hope very, very soon. So we'll keep you posted. We'll keep you posted on that. And just a final word on the WTO looking at this issue. You know that at the end of this year, we're going to have a ministerial conference, and members are considering adopting a package for women, what we call an MC12 outcome, supporting women and furthering the work that has been done in WTO since the establishment of the informal working group on trade and gender last September. And of course, the COVID-19 is very much present in the minds of members while crafting this outcome. I really hope that this will lead to a stronger ecosystem for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anoush. Again, I find your presentation reminds us of the need for a more disaggregated look at impacts across sectors. Clearly, the impact that COVID has exerted has been far deeper in services than in manufacturing, and remains deeper in services. And that, of course, remains a source of preoccupation to the extent that the service economy is one in which female participation is far higher. And so mitigating these impacts remains a first order priority for many countries in their support measures for employment and social protection. I'm going to open the floor to all of the speakers. If you would like to take the floor and add perspectives, you were heavily constrained in your initial presentations, but we have still some time to address other issues and perhaps also take questions from the floor, which I currently do not see on my screen. You would think that 20 months into the pandemic, we would be a bit more IT competent, but we are live. We're displaying our incompetence live right now, but it's a very sobering thing, you know. You just roll with the punches. Let me see. There's a question for Anush that has been posted on the chat box, and it's the following question: how can hub activities assist WTO members to take the next steps at MC12 in respect of trade and gender? In a way, you started to address this question, but perhaps you can tell us a bit more about the possible landing zone of a declaration in December. And then there's a second question for Jane, and it's a difficult one, Jane. Is there any empirical evidence that gender mainstreaming actually works? I start with Anush.
Thank you, Pierre. So actually, this is exactly the objective of this session today, is just to show how research can really support policy making. All the findings that we just explained today, and the links we made with several examples of trade policies, whether at the national level, regional, or international level, shows that there is room for this link to happen. So this is why we called this session today from gender research to policy action. The idea here is to build this bridge between the hub and the WTO members through the through the informal working group on trade and gender, and to regularly inform members about the various research that has been conducted, the results, the findings, to really inform their work in the WTO. As far as MC12 is concerned, how the hub can support MC12, well, I'm hoping that it could be done. Although I think, you know, in terms of timing and the fact that the hub is very new, it's a new baby. So I think we will have to wait how we can support the work of members at MC12. But already we're going to publish all the different findings of all the researchers that are part of the hub on our WTO website in the next few weeks. Now we're almost ready. We have the links. We will have all the names of the participants. We will be helping in coordination if there are any questions or requests for support. So this hub is just goes beyond the just being a platform network. It's really built as a specific tool to really support policy making on women's economic empowerment.
Thank you very much, Anush. Jane, the tough question. What are the metrics of success in gender mainstreaming?
Yeah, send the tough questions to me. I'll give it a try. So we're just to start out, you know, we are at the very beginning of looking at the impacts of trade on women. This has been a topic under discussion for just a few years. And when you compare it to some of the, you know, topics that have been out there for many years, like exchange rates, for example, you know, where we have been discussing for what, 50 years, what the impact of exchange rates is. Well, we're at the very beginning, and we know that gender provisions are being included more and more in regional trade agreements. There's a great WTO paper out on, counting how many those are and where they are and, what they entail. But many of them are fairly vague. So gender mainstreaming, yes, we're at the beginning, but some of them are in relation to gender in the preamble of a regional trade agreement, or it's kind of best effort provisions. So in order to actually quantify, in terms of empirical evidence, which was the question, in order to actually quantify, we're going to have something fairly specific. And that has started showing up in different regional trade agreements in the very recent past, I would say not more than 2 or 3 years. But this is where we're going, because for years we have been, and we were just talking about this before the session with Pierre, for years we have been measuring the gains from trade and looking at it as an aggregate. Now we are much more interested in the distributional impacts of trade and looking at a disaggregated level, the impacts of trade on women, the impacts of trade on other groups in society. Some countries are trying to look at the impacts of trade on indigenous people, micro and small and medium enterprises, that's on the agenda as well. And others are looking at a regional analysis, understanding that trade is not going to impact regions in a different country in the same way. And so, this is where we are going. We are no longer looking at the aggregate impacts, but looking at a much more disaggregated level, which we should be, because we know that some of the impacts of trade are not measured at the aggregate. And there are, winners and losers, and we should know who those are and think about what kind of complementary policies are necessary to understandably do something for the losers of those trade agreements. And that is, of course, under discussion.
We're probably going to need to find a better word than losers. I hate using that word in discussions of the distributional impacts of trade, even though it's out there. Thanks, Jane, for that answer. I think you're absolutely right. We are just at the beginning of a journey that needs to be rooted in much greater empirical evidence. Because donors are attaching far more importance to this issue, necessarily they will be asking for the institutions that implement these measures to have very concrete operational monitoring and evaluation frameworks. And so we're going to see this data generated in the coming years, all the more so where provisions are legally binding and enforceable, where it's much easier to measure impacts than if it's just a soft law provisions. We have just a few minutes left. I'd like to give the floor to each of our 3 speakers, Amelia, Renata, and Rita, for some very short final observations that may be linked either to some of the questions that we've just heard or just additional thoughts that you'd like to share with us. And I will start with Amelia.
Thanks so much, Pierre. I think I would like to go back to the issue of the regulatory environment and the gender practices. And we'd like to link also to the contributions that Renata and Rita made. I mean, we look at international trade agreements as the main channel through which legal background and legal issues in relation to gender are studied, but also in our work, we find that there are important company-specific policy aspects that need to be addressed. Are multinational different than domestic companies? How this impact the whole global value chain analysis? And I think given the global context that we are trying to look at and the development context, it's important to further look into the expected social and environmental responsibilities and standards of companies within the trade and investment debate. We know that increasingly multinationals are expected to report these indicators, and for development policy, this is very important. But a key challenge for us as economists, beyond the legal contributions of colleagues like Renata and Rita, Jane, and all in the group, is the quality of disclosure. the quality and the harmonization of reporting standard. And I think this is important to bring to the table, because if these indicators are not reported, and if we don't know really how policies are implemented, what are the policies, what are the wage gaps beyond the board, it will be difficult to craft development policies. And I just give you a figure in our report. We show that among the largest 100 multinationals, only 23 report on gender practices. So we have a long way to go on this. And the most reported indicator is share of women on the board, but we have to go below to middle level workers and low skill workers to really understand the gender gap. I'll stop here to give help.
I think a recurring theme from our discussion is we've come a long way, but there's a hell of a long way to go still. And that is clear, but that's what we're in the business of, actually asking those questions and trying to find answers to them. Let me go to Renata briefly. We have 2 minutes left, so I would ask you for 1 minute and then 1 minute to Amrita.
Excellent. I completely agree with what Amelia was just saying, and I'm more and more interested in knowing how the private sector and also domestic policies are going to implement what we are advocating for in trade agreements, in investment agreements. I think for the investment agreements, we have a longer way to go than for trade agreements. We have been discussing it more and more in the trade area for the past years. But I think the private sector and the domestic regulations have a very important role. How are we going to implement this in the domestic level? And also I'd like to just make a quick comment on mainstreaming gender in agreements that Jane was just talking about. I think this is really important. I think I'm always advocating for that, but also I also take into account the differences of development between countries. For example, I see the model of Canada, the gender-based analysis plus. It's beautiful, but it's very hard to translate that for a country like mine in Brazil. So I think while we are talking about mainstreaming gender in trade agreements, investment agreements, I think we really need to take into account the difference of development levels of countries when having that discussion, together with the domestic policies, together with the private sector role in all this. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Renata. Amrita.
Yeah, so I was hearing the inaugural speech by Dr. Nkosi yesterday, and she said that trade matters for people, and it is for people. Women are included in the people. So whenever I get questioned why trade agreements or trade policies should carve out a space for women issues or domestic violence or other social issues for that instance, my question is, if we can make trade policies work for saving and protecting the lives of dolphins and turtles, we can definitely talk about protecting the economic interest and protecting the empowerment interest of women using the same trade policy instruments. Trade policy instruments have now more and more accommodated non-trade and non-economic concerns such as labor, climate change, human rights, and non-discrimination to a huge extent. I think it's about time that we start talking about binding commitments and binding promises in trade policy instruments.
Very wise words, Amrita. Thanks for expanding the remit of our conversation. And I think it's a very nice point on which to end by expressing, I think, our shared belief that this tent that the Hub is creating should be a very broad tent with bringing in perspectives from many disciplines beyond a narrow focus on trade and investment, but precisely bringing into the conversation the elements of this multiplicity of policy areas that need to be brought into play, all the dots that need to be connected if we are to progress an agenda we all believe in, which is an agenda of women empowerment and gender equality. I'm going to end on that note because we're out of time. We've been out of time for a minute. I hope we're still online. And I'd like to thank all of you who were contributing to this discussion. My apologies to Nadia and Judith. I think one of you had to wake up super early in Canada. So very frustrating. Apologies for this IT kerfuffle. And we very much look forward to seeing you all, hopefully face to face in future events